The knife went through the insurgent's throat so fast he didn't even have time to raise his AK-47. Staff Sergeant Gracie Phillips pulled the blade back with practiced precision, already pivoting toward the second hostile who'd made the fatal mistake of entering her kitchen without permission. Blood sprayed across the stainless steel prep counter where she'd been chopping vegetables 30 seconds earlier. The man gurgled once and collapsed between the industrial refrigerator and the spice rack, his weapon clattering uselessly against linoleum that had seen cleaner days but never this much violence. The second fighter got his rifle halfway up before Phillips's boot caught him in the solar plexus, driving him backward into a rack of pots that crashed down with enough noise to wake the dead, which was appropriate because in about 10 seconds, that's exactly what he was going to be. She'd been cooking scrambled eggs for 100 Marines when the alarm sounded. Now she was cooking something else entirely, and the menu had just gotten very simple: survival or death, with no third option available. But before we show you how a mess hall cook eliminated 15 enemy fighters in 12 minutes using kitchen implements, combat knives, and an HK-416 she'd hidden behind the flour sacks, drop a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from. Because what you're about to witness isn't just about a firefight. It's about the moment an entire forward operating base learned that the quiet woman serving their meals had earned her Force Recon tab in the bloodiest way possible, and she'd never forgotten how. The forward operating base. Sierra 12 sat in the Colombian jungle like a concrete tumor that somebody had tried to disguise with sandbags and concertina wire. The war on narco-insurgents didn't make headlines anymore, but it ground on with the kind of relentless brutality that turned bright-eyed lieutenants into hollow-eyed captains and made senior enlisted personnel start counting days until retirement. Staff Sergeant Gracie Phillips had been assigned to FOB Sierra 12 for 4 months, running the mess hall with the kind of ruthless efficiency that came from years of military discipline applied to the noble art of feeding people who'd rather be anywhere else. She was 32, average height, athletic build hidden under kitchen whites that were always somehow spotless, despite working in an environment where cleanliness was aspirational rather than achievable. Dark hair pulled back in a bun so tight it looked painful, quiet, professional. The kind of person who showed up early, did her job without complaint, and went back to her quarters without socializing. The Marines tolerated her. Some appreciated her cooking, which was significantly better than what they'd experienced at previous postings. Most ignored her completely, which was exactly what Phillips wanted. Because Staff Sergeant Gracie Phillips had a secret that was buried in classified files that most people at FOB Sierra 12 would never see. Before she'd been a cook, before she'd requested transfer to food service, before she'd spent 4 months quietly preparing meals and avoiding attention, she'd been Force Reconnaissance, Marine Special Operations, 3 combat deployments, 47 confirmed kills, a service record that included operations so classified they didn't officially exist, and a psychological evaluation that had recommended she be removed from combat operations after her last mission went sideways in ways that still gave her nightmares. The kitchen was her therapy. The routine, the predictability, the simple satisfaction of transforming raw ingredients into meals that sustained warriors. It wasn't glory. It wasn't exciting. But it was safe. And after 18 months of doing things that would haunt her until she died, safe was exactly what Phillips needed. At least, that's what she'd thought until 0430 hours on a Tuesday morning when everything went to hell. She'd been prepping breakfast: scrambled eggs, bacon, hash browns, toast, coffee strong enough to strip paint. The usual. First serving was at 0530, which meant she needed everything ready by 0515 to account for the inevitable early arrivals who'd skip morning PT for extra food. The explosion came from the eastern perimeter, a rolling boom that rattled pots hanging from ceiling hooks and made the industrial ovens shudder. Philip's hands stopped mid-motion, knife poised over a cutting board covered in diced peppers. Her mind, trained by years of combat operations, immediately began calculating threat assessments before her conscious thought could catch up. Single explosion. Satchel charge, or RPG. Eastern perimeter meant they'd hit the least defended section. Professional assault, not random harassment. This was planned. The alarm started wailing, that distinctive oscillating shriek that meant the base was under attack. Small arms fire erupted across the compound, the sharp crack of M4 carbines mixing with the heavier rattle of AK-47s, a lot of AK-47s. Phillips moved to the kitchen's rear door, looking out across the compound. In the pre-dawn darkness, muzzle flashes lit up like deadly fireflies. She could see Marines scrambling from barracks, some still pulling on gear, others already returning fire from whatever cover they could find. The attack was concentrated on the eastern and southern sections, which meant... She turned back to the kitchen just as the northern door crashed open and 3 men poured through, weapons up, faces covered with bandanas and tactical scarves. Not regular narco-insurgents. These were trained fighters moving with tactical precision that spoke of military experience. The first man through scanned the kitchen with his AK-47, searching for threats. What he saw was a woman in kitchen whites standing by a prep counter with a vegetable knife in her hand. His weapon started to swing toward her, but he was already dismissing her as a non-combatant, focusing on the doorways that might contain armed resistance. That dismissal cost him his life. Phillips moved with speed that seemed impossible for someone who'd been peacefully chopping vegetables seconds earlier. The kitchen knife came out of her hand in a throw that had been practiced 10,000 times, refined in training sessions that most Marines never experienced. It rotated once, exactly once, and buried itself in the insurgent's throat just above his sternum, severing his carotid artery and dropping him like someone had cut his power supply. She was already moving before he hit the ground, diving behind the industrial prep counter as the second fighter opened fire. Rounds punched through stainless steel and shattered tile, filling the air with fragments and the distinctive smell of cordite. Phillips hit the floor and rolled, coming up next to where she'd secreted her personal weapon 4 months earlier. Behind a 50-pound bag of flour, wrapped in oilcloth and hidden where no casual inspection would ever find it, was an HK-416 assault rifle with a shortened barrel and suppressor. 4 magazines taped together Ranger style. A weapon that definitely wasn't authorized for mess hall personnel, but which Phillips had decided was necessary insurance against exactly this kind of situation. The flour bag took 3 rounds, exploding in a white cloud that provided perfect concealment. Phillips emerged from the dust storm with the HK-416 already shouldered, her muscle memory taking over like she'd never stopped being an operator. The second fighter saw the weapon come up and tried to adjust his aim, but he was firing an AK on full automatic with minimal training, spraying rounds in a general direction and hoping something would connect. Phillips fired twice, controlled pairs, center mass, and watched him fold backward into the doorway. The third fighter was smarter. He'd taken cover behind an industrial refrigerator and was firing in disciplined bursts, keeping Phillips pinned while he maneuvered for a better angle. Through the chaos of gunfire and alarms, she could hear more insurgents entering the mess hall through other access points. This wasn't a random probe. They were clearing the building systematically. Phillips's mind shifted into the combat mode she'd spent 4 months trying to suppress. Tactical assessment became automatic. 3 confirmed hostiles in the kitchen, unknown number in the dining area. Primary objective, survive. Secondary objective, deny the enemy control of the mess hall, which connected to the armory via an access corridor that couldn't be defended if hostiles gained this position. She moved again, this time to the left, using the layout she'd memorized through 4 months of daily work. The industrial dishwasher provided cover while she flanked the refrigerator position. The insurgent hiding there was good, but he'd made the mistake of assuming his opponent was a cook with minimal combat training. Phillips came around the corner low and fast, her HK-416 tracking to where she knew he'd be. The fighter saw her half a second too late, tried to bring his AK around. She put 3 rounds in him from 5 feet away, the suppressed weapon making sharp coughing sounds that were lost in the general cacophony of the battle raging across the compound. Kitchen clear, dining area compromised, corridor to armory critical vulnerability. She moved toward the connecting door, reloading on the move with practiced efficiency. The HK-416 felt like an extension of her body, every control and manipulation happening without conscious thought. 18 months away from combat operations hadn't dulled the skills that had been carved into her nervous system through years of training and deployment. The dining area was chaos. 4 more insurgents were moving between tables, using the heavy furniture as cover while they worked toward the armory corridor. They'd already killed 2 Marines who'd been on early duty, bodies sprawled near the serving line in spreading pools of blood. Phillips felt something cold and familiar settle into her chest, the analytical detachment that let operators function in situations where normal human responses would be paralytic. She'd spent 4 months trying to avoid this feeling, trying to be normal, trying to forget what it felt like to be the predator instead of prey. But the feeling came back like it had never left, and with it came the terrible clarity that made Force Recon Marines so effective. She identified targets, calculated angles, measured distances. The HK-416 came up smoothly, red dot sight, finding the first hostile's profile as he moved between tables. Phillips fired twice, dropped him, transitioned to the second target before the first had finished falling. The insurgents reacted with trained discipline, returning fire while seeking better cover. Rounds cracked past Phillips' head, close enough to feel the displacement pressure. She dropped behind the serving counter, the stainless steel barrier catching multiple impacts that would have killed her. But she'd already read their positions, already knew where they'd move. She waited 3 seconds, counting in her head with perfect precision, then rose and fired at exactly where she knew the third hostile would be. The man appeared in her sights like he'd been choreographed, his AK coming up toward where she'd been standing. Phillips's rounds caught him high in the chest, the impact spinning him sideways into a table that collapsed under his weight. The fourth fighter was smarter. He'd gone to ground behind the serving line's industrial equipment, using the heavy machinery as cover while he called out to his comrades in rapid Spanish. Phillips's language training was good enough to understand the gist. They were taking heavier resistance than expected, needed reinforcement. The woman was armed and dangerous. Good, she thought with cold satisfaction. At least someone here understands the situation. She heard movement from the kitchen, more insurgents entering through the breached northern door. The tactical picture was degrading. She was one operator with limited ammunition, facing an unknown number of hostiles who were coordinating their assault. By the numbers, she should withdraw, link up with the Marine defenders outside, establish a defensive perimeter. But withdrawing meant giving them access to the armory corridor. And the armory contained enough weapons and ammunition to turn this from a raid into a sustained siege that would cost dozens of Marine lives. Phillips made a decision that her psychological evaluation had suggested she was no longer capable of making rationally. She decided to hold the mess hall alone against whatever force the enemy could bring to bear, because some positions were worth dying for. The insurgent behind the serving line made his move, popping up to fire a burst while his companion provided covering fire from the kitchen. Phillips was already moving, anticipating the tactic, because she'd used it herself dozens of times. She went left instead of right, breaking his targeting solution, and put 2 rounds through the serving line's stainless steel panel at exactly the angle where she'd calculated his torso would be. The screaming confirmed the hit. The man stumbled into view, weapon forgotten, hands clutching his abdomen where bullets had punched through steel and flesh. Phillips's third round ended his suffering with mechanical efficiency. 5 confirmed kills. Unknown number remaining. Ammunition check, 2 magazines remaining, plus the partial in her weapon, maybe 80 rounds total. Would have to make them count. More insurgents poured through the kitchen entrance. Phillips counted 4, moving in coordinated pairs with the kind of tactical discipline that confirmed her initial assessment. These weren't random narco-insurgents. This was a trained assault force with military experience. She fell back to the armory corridor entrance, using the doorway's natural choke point to channel the attack. The HK-416 barked in controlled bursts as targets appeared, each shot placed with precision born from thousands of hours of training. One hostile went down, then another. The survivors took cover, their return fire chewing up the doorframe but unable to connect with Phillips's protected position. A grenade bounced into the dining area, spinning across linoleum with deadly intent. Phillips recognized it instantly. Soviet-era RGD-5 4-second fuse, lethal radius of 15 meters. She had maybe 2 seconds before detonation. She kicked a dining table onto its side, and dropped behind it, pulling her body into as tight a profile as possible. The grenade detonated with a blast that was felt more than heard, over pressure waves slamming into her improvised cover with enough force to shift the heavy table several inches. Shrapnel whined overhead, punching into walls and equipment. Phillips's ears were ringing, but she was already moving before the debris stopped falling. Combat experience had taught her that the seconds after a grenade detonation were when attackers advanced, expecting defenders to be stunned or wounded. She came up firing, catching 2 insurgents in mid-rush. They'd been charging her position with weapons ready, expecting to find her disoriented behind the overturned table. Instead, they found controlled pairs of 5.56 millimeter rounds that dropped them before they could adjust their tactics. 7 confirmed kills. The math was starting to work in her favor, but only if no more reinforcements arrived. As if responding to that thought, the kitchen door crashed open again and 3 more fighters entered. But these were different, better equipped, moving with even more precision. Professional soldiers, possibly former military contractors, the kind of men who'd trained with national military forces before selling their skills to the highest bidder. The tactical situation shifted from bad to critical. Phillips was alone, running low on ammunition, facing an enemy force that was adapting to her capabilities. Outside, the battle for the compound continued to rage, which meant no one was coming to help her. The Marines were too busy defending their own positions to worry about the mess hall. The lead contractor, she labeled him Alpha in her mind, directed his team with hand signals that were unmistakably military. They began a coordinated advance using suppressing fire and movement techniques that would have been taught at Fort Benning or Quantico. These men knew what they were doing, and they'd clearly identified her as a significant threat. Phillips had one advantage. She knew this terrain intimately. 4 months of working in this mess hall meant she understood every angle, every piece of cover, every line of sight. She'd unconsciously memorized the space during countless hours of cooking and cleaning, and now that knowledge became a tactical asset. She moved through the dining area like a ghost, using equipment and furniture as cover while she engaged targets with ruthless efficiency. The HK-416 suppressor kept her position ambiguous, making it difficult for the contractors to identify exactly where fire was coming from. She'd shoot twice, move, shoot again from a different angle. Classic shoot-and-scoot tactics that kept the enemy off balance. Alpha took a round in the shoulder, spinning him around but not dropping him. Body armor, Phillips noted. All 3 contractors were wearing plates. She adjusted her aim points, targeting heads and hips, areas where plates didn't provide protection. The second contractor, Bravo, went down with a round that caught him in the pelvis, shattering bone and dropping him into a screaming heap. Alpha dragged him to cover while the third contractor, Charlie, laid down suppressing fire that forced Phillips behind the overturned serving counter. She was down to her last magazine, maybe 30 rounds, against 3 armored, trained professionals who were now fully aware they were facing a skilled opponent. The situation demanded either tactical genius or complete insanity. Phillips decided to provide both. She grabbed a fire extinguisher from its wall mount, pulled the pin, and lobbed it into the middle of the dining area while simultaneously opening fire on its base. The extinguisher detonated in a cloud of white powder that filled the space with choking fog, reducing visibility to near zero. Phillips moved through the chemical smoke with her eyes closed, navigating by memory while the contractors stumbled blindly. She heard Charlie coughing, tracked the sound, put 3 rounds through the cloud where his torso should be. The coughing stopped abruptly. Alpha was shouting orders, trying to coordinate a withdrawal through the kitchen. Phillips followed the sound, firing blind, but using her understanding of the space to calculate where he'd be. She heard a grunt of pain, a body hitting the floor, the clatter of a weapon being dropped. When the fog cleared, 3 more bodies lay scattered across the dining area. 10 confirmed kills in approximately 8 minutes. Not bad for someone who was supposed to be cooking breakfast. But the battle wasn't over. Through the kitchen door, she could hear more insurgents gathering, presumably preparing for another assault. They'd be more cautious now, having learned that the mess hall was defended by someone who knew what they were doing. Phillips did a quick ammunition check. 15 rounds remaining. Not enough for another protracted engagement. She needed to change the tactical situation before they overwhelmed her through simple weight of numbers. The armory corridor beckoned. If she could reach the weapons locker, she could rearm and turn this from a desperate last stand into a defensible position, but moving to the corridor meant exposing herself to fire from the kitchen entrance. She had maybe 20 seconds before the next assault wave. Time to decide, hold or move. Phillips chose to move. She sprinted toward the armory corridor, firing behind her to suppress any pursuit. Rounds chased her across the dining area, close enough that she felt the heat of their passing. Something tugged at her sleeve, a near miss that would have been fatal if she'd been fractionally slower. The armory corridor was short, maybe 20 feet, ending in a heavy security door that required 2 different keys. Phillips had one key, her mess hall supervisor key that provided access to administrative areas. The armory required the duty officer's key, which she definitely didn't have. She hit the security door at full speed, bounced off it, spun around with her HK-416 up to cover the corridor entrance. The insurgents were regrouping in the dining area, preparing for a coordinated push. She could hear them shouting to each other, working themselves up for the charge. 15 rounds, 1 magazine, 20 feet of corridor with no cover and a locked door behind her. By any rational calculation, she was dead. But rationality had stopped being relevant about 10 minutes ago. The insurgents came in a rush, 6 men charging the corridor entrance with weapons blazing, planning to overwhelm her through sheer volume of fire. It was a sound tactic against a defender with limited ammunition and no escape route. It would have worked against anyone else. Phillips went full automatic, burning through her remaining ammunition in a sustained burst that turned the corridor entrance into a kill zone. The HK-416 emptied its magazine in 3 seconds, putting rounds downrange with mechanical precision. Bodies dropped, stacked up in the entrance like cordwood. The survivors fell back, dragging wounded comrades, their assault broken by the withering fire. Then, the HK-416's bolt locked back on an empty chamber, and Phillips was out of ammunition. She dropped the empty rifle and drew her knife, a KABAR that had been with her through 3 deployments and more close-quarters fighting than she wanted to remember. The blade was 7 inches of carbon steel that had taken lives in circumstances where firearms were ineffective or unavailable. 2 insurgents appeared at the corridor entrance, weapons up, ready to finish the fight. They saw her standing there with just a knife, no rifle, no cover, nowhere to go. They smiled, confident in their advantage. Phillips waited until they were 10 feet away, close enough that she could see the surprise in their eyes when she moved. She went low and fast under their firing lines and came up inside their guard with the knife already moving. The first man took the blade under his ribs, angled up toward his heart. She twisted and pulled, felt the resistance as steel parted flesh, then kicked him away and turned toward the second fighter. He got his AK halfway around before she closed the distance and drove the knife into his throat, silencing his scream before it could fully form. Blood sprayed hot across her face and kitchen whites, painting her in the kind of evidence that would be impossible to explain away. 11 confirmed kills. Knife work now, down to the most primitive form of combat, more hostiles in the dining area. She could hear them arguing, trying to decide how to handle the woman who'd already killed nearly a dozen of their comrades. Some wanted to withdraw, others wanted revenge. The argument bought her precious seconds. Phillips wiped blood from her eyes and assessed her situation with the cold clarity of someone who'd been in worse circumstances and survived. No ammunition, 1 knife, locked door behind her, unknown number of hostiles between her and safety. The tactical picture was unsalvageable by conventional means. Time for unconventional solutions. The mess hall had industrial gas lines feeding the cooking equipment. Phillips had spent 4 months maintaining that equipment, which meant she knew exactly where the shutoff valves were and how to override the safety systems. It would be dangerous, potentially catastrophic if done incorrectly. But dying was also dangerous, and at least this option came with the possibility of taking the enemy with her. She moved back into the dining area, using overturned tables for cover. The insurgents saw her coming and opened fire, but their aim was degraded by fear and the knowledge that she'd already killed so many of their comrades. Rounds went wide or high, giving her the seconds she needed to reach the kitchen. The gas shutoff valve was behind the industrial ovens. Phillips twisted it to the closed position, then used her knife to jam the safety release so it couldn't be easily turned back on. Gas began hissing into the kitchen from the compromised system, invisible and deadly. The insurgents were advancing again, sensing that their prey was finally cornered. They moved cautiously now, weapons up, checking corners. Professional clearing techniques. They'd learned from their mistakes. Phillips grabbed a kitchen lighter, the kind used to ignite pilot lights, and held it up so the approaching hostiles could see it clearly. Then she spoke in Spanish, her accent rough but comprehensible. "Gas leak. Kitchen's full of it. I light this, we all die." The advancing insurgents froze. They could smell it now, the distinctive odor of natural gas filling the confined space. One spark and the entire mess hall would become a fireball that would kill everyone inside. "Drop weapons," Phillips ordered, still holding the lighter, "or we all burn." For a long moment, nobody moved. The standoff hung in perfect tension, life and death separated by the flick of a thumb on a plastic lighter. Then, from outside, a new sound cut through the battle noise, the distinctive thump of helicopter rotors, not just one bird, multiple aircraft coming in fast and low. Through the mess hall's windows, Phillips could see gunships taking up position, miniguns swiveling toward enemy positions. The cavalry had arrived. The insurgents heard it too. Their assault had failed, their casualties were mounting, and now they were trapped in a building with a woman who was clearly willing to immolate everyone to deny them their objective. The cost-benefit calculation shifted decisively. They withdrew, pulling back through the kitchen in disciplined order, leaving their dead behind. Phillips watched them go, still holding the lighter, still ready to end it all if they tried anything stupid. When the last hostile disappeared through the northern entrance, she finally lowered the lighter and turned off the damaged gas valve properly. Then she sat down on the blood-soaked floor and waited for the Marines to secure the compound. The after-action report would later describe the defense of FOB Sierra 12 as a near-run thing that succeeded due to determined resistance by base personnel. The mess hall engagement was noted in a single paragraph. One defender held critical position against multiple enemy assault waves, preventing access to armory facilities. That one defender was being treated by a corpsman when Captain Morrison found her. He was the base commander, a combat veteran with 2 deployments and a growing collection of gray hair that came from making life and death decisions on a daily basis. "Staff Sergeant Phillips," he said, looking at her blood-soaked kitchen whites and the bodies scattered throughout her workspace. "I think we need to have a conversation about your previous duty assignments." Phillips just nodded, too tired to be evasive. "Yes, sir. That would probably be appropriate." "Your personnel file says you're a cook, that you requested food service duty after medical leave." Morrison gestured at the carnage surrounding them. "But this doesn't look like cooking to me." "I made breakfast for about 15 people," Phillips replied with exhausted humor. "Just not the way they expected." Morrison almost smiled. "Force Recon?" "Yes, sir. 3 deployments, then some trouble on the last one. The counselors thought I should do something less stressful." "How's that working out?" Phillips looked at the bodies, the blood, the damage. Then she looked at the armory corridor that remained secure because she'd held this position alone against impossible odds. "I think I need a new therapist, sir." This time Morrison did smile. "I think you need a new duty assignment. We've got a security team that could use someone with your particular skill set, assuming you're interested in going back to work." Phillips considered this. She'd spent 4 months trying to be normal, trying to convince herself that she could leave the violence behind and find peace in routine domestic duties. Then, violence had found her anyway, and she'd responded with all the lethal competence she'd thought she'd wanted to forget. Maybe the lesson wasn't that she needed to avoid combat. Maybe the lesson was that warriors don't stop being warriors just because you change their job description. "I'm interested," she said finally, "but on one condition." "What's that?" "I still get to cook breakfast once a week. Marines need to eat, and I'm good at it." Morrison laughed, a sound of relief and respect. "Deal. But maybe we get you an apron that says something other than 'Kiss the Cook.' How about Cook, Force Recon Marine? Choose your battles wisely." How about we just put your rank and name and let people figure out the rest on their own? Phillips nodded, accepting the compromise. She stood up, wincing at muscles that were already starting to stiffen from the adrenaline dump. Around her, Marines were securing the mess hall, photographing the scene, collecting evidence. One young corporal stopped to stare at her, his eyes wide. Staff Sergeant, I just wanted to say, I'll never complain about your food again. The food was always good, Corporal, Phillips replied. You just needed the right perspective to appreciate it. As she walked out of the mess hall, escorted by MPs who would want detailed statements about the engagement, Phillips caught her reflection in a window. Blood-soaked, exhausted, looking like she'd fought a war single-handedly because she basically had. But underneath the gore and fatigue, she saw something else. She saw someone who'd found peace not by avoiding violence, but by understanding when violence was necessary and being capable enough to apply it with precision. The mess hall would be cleaned, repaired, returned to service within a week. The blood would be scrubbed away, the bullet holes patched, the damaged equipment replaced. Within a month, new Marines would eat breakfast there without knowing what had happened in that space. But the ones who'd been there, who'd seen the aftermath, who'd counted the bodies and measured the impossible odds, they would remember. They'd tell the story in quiet voices during night watches, passing along the legend of the cook who turned out to be something much more dangerous. Phillips requested one thing before accepting her new security assignment: permission to finish breakfast service that morning. Morrison granted it, understanding that rituals mattered, that continuity was important, that warriors needed to prove to themselves they could still perform normal tasks after doing extraordinary violence. So 2 hours after the firefight ended, with the compound secured and medics treating the wounded, Staff Sergeant Gracie Phillips returned to her kitchen. She cleaned the blood from the counters, replaced the damaged equipment, and began cooking breakfast with the same methodical precision she'd applied to eliminating 11 hostile fighters. The Marines who came through the chow line that morning were quiet, respectful. They'd heard what happened, seen the evidence, understood that the woman serving their eggs had saved their lives by holding a position that should have been overrun. One lance corporal, barely 19 years old, reached the serving line and met Phillips's eyes. "Thank you, Staff Sergeant," he said simply. Phillips nodded, acknowledging the gratitude without false modesty. "Just doing my job, Marine." "Which job?" he asked. "Cook or warrior?" Phillips considered the question, then smiled slightly. "Yes." Because that was the truth, wasn't it? She was both. A cook who made sure Marines were fed properly, a warrior who protected those Marines when violence came calling. The two roles weren't contradictory, they were complementary. Some people were builders, creating things that made the world better. Others were protectors, standing between civilization and chaos. Phillips had learned she could be both, as long as she stopped trying to deny half of who she was. The FOB Sierra 12 story spread through Marine circles with the speed of good gossip. Details were embellished, numbers inflated, but the core remained true. A mess hall cook had single-handedly held critical infrastructure against a coordinated assault by trained fighters, killing 11 and forcing the survivors to withdraw. Recruitment offices started getting questions from women asking about force recon opportunities. Training instructors used the engagement as a case study in defensive tactics and situational awareness. And somewhere in the Pentagon, someone updated doctrine to reflect lessons learned from an operation that had succeeded despite, or perhaps because of, its defender's unconventional background. The Marines at FOB Sierra 12 learned a fundamental lesson that morning, one that every warrior eventually discovers if they survive long enough. Capability matters more than credentials. Training transcends job titles, and the most dangerous person in any room is often the one nobody's paying attention to. Staff Sergeant Gracie Phillips embodied that lesson. She cooked breakfast, maintained equipment, filed reports, and performed all the mundane tasks that kept a forward operating base functioning. But underneath that routine domesticity was a warrior who'd been forged in combat so intense it had broken her psychologically. Except it hadn't broken her. It had refined her, taught her when violence was necessary and when it should be avoided. given her the wisdom to choose peace when possible and the capability to deliver overwhelming force when required. That wisdom, that balance, was what made Force Recon Marines so effective. They weren't mindless killers or adrenaline junkies. They were professionals who understood violence at a fundamental level and could deploy it with surgical precision when circumstances demanded. The narco-insurgents who'd attacked FOB Sierra 12 had made a tactical error. They'd assumed the mess hall would be lightly defended, possibly undefended, an easy target that would provide access to the armory and weapons that could sustain a longer siege. Instead, they'd encountered someone who'd spent years learning how to kill efficiently in close quarters. Someone who'd hidden an unauthorized weapon because experience had taught her that being prepared was better than being surprised. Someone who'd turned a cooking facility into a fortress and defended it with the kind of lethal competence that only came from extensive training and multiple combat deployments. 11 dead insurgents later, the survivors had learned an expensive lesson about assumptions and underestimation. The ones who lived would tell stories about the American woman who'd killed their comrades with knives and rifles and threatened to burn everyone alive rather than surrender her position. Those stories would spread through insurgent networks, creating a legend that would make future attackers more cautious, more careful, more aware that sometimes the least threatening-looking target was actually the most dangerous. And in the mess hall at FOB Sierra 12, Staff Sergeant Gracie Phillips would continue serving breakfast, cooking lunch, preparing dinner, quietly, professionally, without drawing attention to herself, until the next time someone made the mistake of thinking a cook couldn't be a warrior. Then they'd learn, in the most final way possible, that appearances mean nothing when capability speaks.